So next we have Richard Brown, and he will discuss about it's written on the slide, so I don't have to say it, but I will give it a try. Being different takes aeons, a tales of the endless RC.
Thank you very much. So yes, first, who the heck am I? Well, I'm Richard. I've been doing open source stuff for like 20 years now. This is like my 13th FOSDEM. I build distros, and I'm going to be talking about the latest one that I've built. After you've got a little introduction about what the heck is this Aeon thing anyway, going to be talking about the long road that it's traveled. It's 5 years old now. Some of the sort of pain points we've had as we've been putting it together, some little sort of inside baseball stories of what's gone on behind the scenes in the community and stuff as well. And then talking about will we ever actually release the darn thing, and some kind of points to share and maybe discuss when it comes to your own projects, or just like any open source project generally. I think some of this stuff actually can be applied quite generically. So what the heck is Aeon anyway? Well, first, like way back when, I suddenly woke up one morning and realized all this stuff that SUSE was paying me to do in my day job with Enterprise Linux isn't actually good enough. Traditional Linux, we've been building it for years, and we build it like it's a Swiss Army knife. It's great, it's flexible, you can change all the bits and pieces, it's wonderful. But it's great, it's flexible, you can change all the bits and pieces, so everybody does, and they all end up with something different, and it breaks inside itself, and it breaks when you start looking at other bits. It's just massively complicated. And the funny thing is, like, as this has been done more, and more people have been adopting Linux around the world anyway, you kind of see people realizing these inherent problems with that open source Linux flexibility anyway. Because what do users do when they start running Linux? Well, they take this wonderfully complicated, do everything, mega flexible platform, and then they tear it down into some tiny little VM image that only does one thing. Because they don't want all that change. They don't want all that complexity. Making minimal VMs, putting everything in containers, ignoring the fact that we spend all our time in traditional distro land coming up with nice life cycles, and then they just don't patch the darn thing and then replace it with the next version eventually. Spending tons and tons of effort on automation and configuration management, and So, people know these weaknesses in Linux, but we've all kind of just trained ourselves into, avoiding them rather than actually really fixing the distribution at the heart. So, my view, the perfect Linux should just work. It shouldn't need these sort of complicated steps of taking it and then ripping it down and making it smaller. Shouldn't need complicated policies. Shouldn't need complicated configuration management. All of this stuff should just be baked in, so out of the box, your Linux does the thing that it's meant to be doing. So it should be optimized for basically what everybody's doing these days anyway. It should be optimized for single-purpose installations, small amount of services on there as possible, have the updates automatically happen, have recovery when the updates go wrong automatically happen. Use it at scale, because especially on the server side of things, everyone's deploying more than one instance these days, and have the whole thing ready to be orchestrated and maybe centrally administered, but not necessarily need it, because in fact you don't need it if half this stuff ends up working anyway. And in addition to doing all of that thing, it should be avoiding needing any manual maintenance, ever being in an inconsistent state. I mean, you heard about reproducible builds right earlier, whatever state it's in, you should know that's what you want it to be and how you want it to be. And you shouldn't need to have any of that complicated orchestration tooling, even if you do support it. And I would say for servers, that perfect Linux already exists. MicroOS from the OpenSUSE project is that OS already. It's a rolling release, which may surprise some people when I talk about a rolling release for a server. But, because it does all of that stuff I just talked about, it does the automatic updates, it does the automatic repair. The fact that we don't have a life cycle where you have to worry about what major version I'm running, you don't need to. You just deploy it. It runs. It patches itself. It fixes itself. Your containers all run. Your services all run. The footprint is nice and small. I mean, my microOS servers now, I think the oldest one is actually older than microOS. But yeah, so it's 7 years, it's been running on its own. I never need to touch the darn thing. But it's still running, it's still updating, it's still all good. But I don't just run servers. I mean, I'm a desktop user too, and desktops are special. They're not something that you can just hide away in a data center. You're physically touching the thing. If anything goes wrong with your desktop, I'd actually argue it's worse than if anything goes wrong with your server, because you were going to use that desktop to fix the server. You can't. You're not going to run around with 2 laptops and be able to roll over to the other side of the cluster. It's got to be more reliable than your servers would be. And yeah, if something does go wrong, you really need to get back to a working state incredibly quickly. And that's why I made Aeon. So today, it is just like microOS, reliable, predictable, immutable. We're opinionated. It's GNOME only, aiming very much for more of a Chromebook-like experience. I'm a lazier developer than I was 10 years ago. I just want my laptop to work. I don't want to be spending my time messing around with it. Deploying it as an image, so I know I'm running exactly what I built and what I should be running. Keeping the footprint on the machine as small as possible, but not so small that it's actually a pain. So printing, gaming, multimedia stuff, all of that's baked in, and all of it just working straight out of the box. But that's today. Wasn't where we began at all. So the history lesson now. Started this first almost 5 years ago now, which is really weird, as a SUSE Hack Week project. SUSE gives employees a week every now and again to mess around, do whatever they want. So we already had microOS, and I was like, okay, I want to have a desktop on top of microOS. It's going to be awesome. And that's basically what I built. So the microOS desktop. Did it as a system role, so basically an alternative installation option when you're installing microOS, which meant it was basically a nice, simple RPM pattern that would sit on top of all the other RPM patterns which microOS was already building, which meant it was dependent on all the stuff that microOS was already building, and we shared the same installer, we shared the same ISO. I thought I was saving myself time and effort. It didn't really work out that way. Because that's where the initial technical problems were. Because microOS is a very server-orientated operating system, I ended up with a very server-orientated desktop. I was having to work around all the issues of having extra drivers for VMs I didn't care about, and cloud tooling that I didn't care about, and embedded tooling that I didn't care about, and then not being able to run any of my graphic stuff because that wasn't on the microOS image. Having to really have a hard time with the core configuration. Things like SE Linux policies. That's, you've got your one policy for your entire system, and if that's written with a server in mind, it's going to bump up against a lot of desktop use cases, really, really, really common. And you go to your security maintainers, and they're like, yeah, we could fix that, but then that's going to be way too much of a hole for everyone who's actually using microOS as a server like it's meant to be, right? And also then we would have weird and wonderful interactions because microOS has some of these additional patterns for things like cockpit and remote attestation. People would try and mix and match and play around with weird and wonderful combinations, which I guess is great fun, but it just always broke, and I was never in a position to really fix either, because I'm not going to go fix cockpit to run on a desktop. It doesn't really make sense. And yeah, sticking with the same ISO and the same RPM installer, we were stuck with some very basic common workflow problems. On the server, it makes perfect sense to always have a root account. I wanted to just have a user account with sudo privileges. Could I tell the installer to not do that? No. For a different product, maybe, but for the same product with a different pattern, it doesn't magically know that you press that one button to install that one pattern. So completely stuck there, completely stuck when it comes to deploying images, and then when I got the whole thing installed, I couldn't actually tell if you'd installed microOS the desktop or microOS the server, which also then started causing weird and wonderful confusion as people started actually adopting this and talking about it on forums, and it's like, okay, I'm running microOS, well, which one? where does this poker board actually go? And also we had sort of, aside from the technical stuff, community problems. Because it was a system role, which is a installation option in the AST, we had community members that kind of went, yeah, cool, I'm going to, I don't like GNOME, so I'm going to contribute my favorite desktop environment instead. And in fact, what they kind of really did was, I'm going to make Richard maintain the desktop environment because I'm going to disappear immediately afterwards. And that's how MicroOS Desktop KDE was born. And why I had to rename MicroOS Desktop to MicroOS Desktop GNOME. And that brought tons of problems. There was the technical ones. Because there's a lot of stuff that's common between desktops, we thought, okay, fine. Instead of having MicroOS Desktop as one pattern, we'll have a common pattern and a KDE one and a GNOME one. So suddenly there's an argument of which package goes in which pattern, and where's the right place to actually put it, which was always pointless because it always ended up being me and the same team maintaining all three patterns at one point. But yeah, and then you put it in the wrong one and half the desktops break. We ended up with lots of attention from the KDE user base in OpenSUSE, which was great, but one extra contributor in several years doesn't actually help. And kind of muddied the water of kind of what we're trying to do here. Meant to be this nice, simple, we provide you a desktop, and suddenly you're like, well, which one now? And you put, instead of this nice vision of a perfect polished desktop, you were suddenly throwing more questions and more options in front of our users, which just undermines the whole point of what we're trying to do. So why didn't we just drop it? Well, I tried. The contributor who originally made it then suddenly appeared after disappearing for several years and went to the OpenSUSE board and made a big stink. And even though the OpenSUSE board technically shouldn't be directing developers, we were directed to keep it in the project, so we did. But it was unmaintained. We kind of hung around for years. We steadily went along with the GNOME side of things, doing an alpha and a beta and a release candidate, while KDE sort of just stayed where it is. So, yes, talking about alphas and betas and stuff, I realize these are loaded terms, so when I come to using them, these are my nice, helpful, hopefully human understandable definitions of what I mean when I say an alpha. When the MicroOS Desktop was an alpha, it kind of worked. It was mostly broken most of the time. When I started calling it a beta, it was almost complete. There was a few things I knew were missing, and it mostly worked, but there could occasionally be issues. And release candidates, which is where we are now, it's complete, at least complete as far as I believe it to be at that day, because definitions change, as you're going to see. But whatever's there, it works, it's reliable, but may have some rough edges. So release really is just a complete sort of, it works, it's ready, it's done. So the first release in MicroOS Desktop GNOME land was sort of release candidate was early 2023. Pretty good state of things. We had a very minimized GNOME installation, no RPM applications in the base OS, apart from the software stack and terminal. Everything being Flatpak from FlatHub, out of the box for GUI applications, DistroBox being out of the box for command line applications, desktop notifications for the background updates, and wherever possible we started avoiding the need for the shared MicroOS installer. So wherever possible we'd have GNOME initial setup, do the work, and try and kind of get ourselves away from being stuck in that workflow. MicroOS Desktop at the time was in alpha and still is today. But was it really an RC by my own definition? Well, kind of. Those rough edges were a bit rougher than they should have been, maybe. We were still dependent on the patterns and the policy kits and the system D presets and all that stuff. Thank you very much. So we had a fair bit of cruft in there. You couldn't run every Flatpak properly, especially like Steam, because SE Linux would get in the way and moan about it. You had to still have a separate root password. The sudo policy wasn't right, and Polkit was constantly asking you to enter the root password when you wanted to change a printer in GNOME, which is awfully annoying. You couldn't actually turn off automatic reboots, so you left your laptop running, it would magically reboot in the middle of the night, just like a microOS server, which really was not fun. Still couldn't distinguish between microOS server and microOS desktop, which was hard for me when I wanted to put out a patch or a fix to just one of them. Couldn't stop users from going into YAS, the OpenSUSE installer, and completely messing with the partitions and making an installation that was completely nonsensical. Couldn't stop them from trying to install KDE and GNOME and 20 other things all at the same time and then wondering why they didn't work. Yeah, and we still had the sort of community confusion of, why aren't you supporting KDE more? Because none of us were working on it. So I decided to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and the microOS desktop project officially renamed in May 2023 to Aeon, as it's now called. Partly an excuse just to have a nice reset and a clearer definition of, this is a GNOME only, desktop only, we're doing this and just this, and this is the name for that, and if you want to do something else and take our code, you can do whatever you want with our code, but call it something else, please. We started addressing the technical debt that we'd built up with all of our previous choices and pursuing the kind of freedoms we had of, okay, this is a new thing, a new start, what do we do if we're kind of not starting from zero, because we're still going to inherit everything we had previously, but not be tied to any previous decision we made. And so we've kind of retroactively now call microOS desktop as Aeon RC1, but we then started work on RC2. And it took pretty much 366 days before we did Aeon RC2, where we have now a brand new installer that we wrote from scratch, using basically, it's a very fancy Zenity wrapper around systemd repo, but it looks pretty. Takes an image, deploys an image to the disk. It's wonderful. It's modular because it's just a lot of bash in the installer, really. So you can add your own install steps or rip out the bits that you don't want, which obviously I was having a lot of pain with. Complete support for ignition and combustion, because we've still kind of, we're one of these immutable distros, so nice having a tool chain where stuff takes care of itself on first boot. And it's a really nice party piece. I wrote a module in Tick which analyzes the operating system it's about to annihilate when it images, and if you happen to have a BTRFS home subvolume on there, like we do on all of our distros, then it copies that to the USB stick, because I made the USB stick read-write, and backs up your Wi-Fi passwords and your SSH keys and everything that's remotely interesting, and then nukes the image and then puts it all back down again, which is a nice factory reset that can be really quite extreme, so I can totally change the layout on the disk without stopping my life, which is really quite nice. In Aeon itself, outside the installer, we got rid of the root password, we got the sudo permissions all changed, Polkit and SE Linux all tuned up, all with tons of reviews and help from the SUSE security team, because the fact that we were doing this under a new name, as a new thing, with a clear focus, was like suddenly all the things they were worried about, like, it's a desktop, okay, we get it, we're fine, do it. And it's like, hey, cool. I mean, okay, also meant we could package it separately too, so you're not going to accidentally get those policies on an OpenSUSE installation. It worked out really nice, actually. We got rid of the automatic rebooting, and yes, like I say, identifiable as Aeon, not as microOS. And then, because feature creep is a thing, we also took care of a whole bunch of stuff which we hadn't cared about a year before. So, using systemd boot as our bootloader, tidying up the boot process so it's completely silent, there's no flickering, it just boots up. Doing ZRAM by default, doing BTRFS compression by default, turning off SSH, being really fancy with x86 64 v3 libraries, and also updating DistroBox automatically. And life was good for a couple of months. And one of the things we wanted at the time, it took a little bit longer, was doing full disk encryption by default. I talked more about this earlier today, where now Aeon offers two separate modes. One, if your hardware is good enough, TPM-backed, automatically unlocking, so yeah, it just works. It's really quite nice. make sure you're booting the system that you're meant to be booting, and then actually means you can rely on stuff like your password in Linux to be secure, because no one's accidentally booting you into a different shell. Or if you have a really old laptop, you get Lux for the passphrase, just like every other distro. It worked really, really well, but that has basically been the rest of the story for 2024, because the technical part was easy, and then we realized there's lots of really different laptops out there with lots of really different UEFIs, and people mess around with different configurations. So it's taken us a little bit of the rest of the year to kind of bed that down, change exactly which bits we're measuring into the TPM, and get it working that it's really kind of there and ready now. Oh, and also getting FW update to actually handle the fact that we use system deboot. Because FW update was completely confused by the fact we were a distro that didn't identify ourselves as a distro in our own bootloader, because we use system deboot. So it got very confused about where to do firmware updates, which, was a bit of a problem. So will we ever actually release Aeon? Yes, but there's one thing that I've got left that I really must address is, it does work technically speaking, but we can't prove that because I haven't got around to writing the OpenQA test yet. So if you want to contribute anything to Aeon right now, that's the number one burning issue. As soon as we have OpenQA tests that we will throw into the OpenSUSE pipeline for releases, then I'll probably be able to say Aeon's released, because we can prove then, it's always working, it's always building, job done. However, that feature creep thing's still happening. At FOSDEM, this list has already got even longer. So meanwhile, I'm almost certainly going to start using UKIs for booting, because literally all the problems I was moaning about last week have been fixed in conversations in the corridor this weekend. There's self-healing improvements. I want to get rid of the TTY consoles, because the booting's flicker 3, but you do still like to see the TTY prompt for a split second before GDM kicks in, and I just want to get rid of that. And Ignaz has added a new feature into transactional updates where we can deploy OCI images, and I kind of just want to use that as another way of reinstalling Aeon, because it just seems like fun. So, but to be honest, if we get the OpenQA testing first, I'll probably just call Aeon released, and we can do all that stuff later. I don't really think any of that's blocking the final release. So, lessons learned. I would say, any project these days, in this day and age, really needs to be aware of, how well defined are your project goals? This was the mistake we made with the Aeon Desktop at first, right? A great idea, door wide open for anyone to contribute anything they want, and then we literally end up spinning our wheels for 2-3 years because other people dive in and kind of start mangling with that scope of the project. So, know the scope of what you want to do, what you're prepared to work on, and or be prepared for some way of redefining all of that dramatically if you really, really have to. It doesn't have to be so painful. We did it. Along with that lesson, one thing I really took away from this story is don't always listen to your community. It's great to have lots of people giving lots of really good ideas, but the ideas are great, the contributions matter more. And if you've already got enough on your plate to get what you want done, focus on what you've already decided. You don't always need to add everything all the time, because otherwise you'll just spend all your time implementing all these cool new ideas, like I've been doing. It's year 5, I'm still in the release candidate stage. This feature creep thing is a blessing, because my laptop's awesome and I'm really enjoying the OS on there, but it's still not quite released yet. It's kind of worth keeping in mind. At some point, I guess you need to just say no. But also, there's no absolutes in this, right? We've gone from being really strict on the scope to then constantly redefining it. Yeah, this distro development stuff is always a little bit nebulous and fun. And I have shot through that perfectly timed for 5 minutes. So, any questions? Open discussion? I've got a couple of prompts there. There's one in the corner. Perfect.
I am the guy that's responsible that now there's system debug and OpenSUSE support.
Okay, so. So you're the guy who's responsible for system debooting.
OpenSUSE proper. Since before you could install it, but it wasn't really configured or anything.
So what was the question? Could you just say it in the microphone? 'Cause I don't think I heard it.
Sorry. I said, are you responsible that system deboot works on OpenSUSE now?
There
Before
are
it was just there. And
There are more people than me who have made that magical thing happen. I'm one of the heavier consumers of their work, yes.
Okay.
But yeah, there's various, depending on the scope of what you want with system deboot in OpenSUSE, there's various different options. You can have a very vanilla installation, or you can have one with sdbootutil where it does all the funky plumbing with all of the OpenSUSE BTRFS snapshots and all that cool stuff.
Anyway, I'm not a GNOME user, but your talk was great and was enlightening.
Thank you.
In some ways.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Anything from anybody else? Anyone have any thoughts on these topics? Anyone think I'm completely wrong when saying you should ignore your community? No? Yeah. Yeah, that's part of it too, actually. Someone just said, depends on how many are working on the project. This started as a passion project. Yeah, okay, we have 300 people in the Telegram group these days, so we're not a tiny project anymore. But yeah, there's still only a limited number of people working on this sort of stuff. Well, okay then. So thank you very much.